Welcome. This session will be focusing on Quality Area 1 of the National Quality Framework in outside school hours care services. This presentation will cover the National Quality Standard and the regulatory requirements for Quality Area 1, the approved learning framework, the cycle of planning with a focus on documentation and critical reflection. Where to next? Support and resources that are available. ACECQA collects and analyses assessment and rating data. The data allows us to see how services are performing and the areas where we can offer support. These diagrams represent data from the 31st of March 2017. The top diagram shows nationally how OSH services are rated against the 7 quality areas of the NQS. Overall, services are performing stronger in Quality Area 5, relationships with children, and some are finding Quality Area 1, educational program and practice, a bit challenging. Also at the national level, the bottom graph shows that the top 2 elements OSH services find the most challenging to meet are 1.2.1, each child's learning and development is assessed as part of an ongoing cycle of planning, documenting and evaluation, and 1.2.3, critical reflection on children's learning and development, both as individuals and in groups, is regularly used to implement the program. The aim of Quality Area 1 of the National Quality Standard is to ensure that the educational program and practice is stimulating and engaging and enhances children's learning and development. In school-aged care services, the program nurtures the development of life skills and complements children's experiences, opportunities and relationships at school, home and in the community. Outside school hours care services offer a unique and fun opportunity for school-aged children to develop and grow. OSH is an important part of the National Quality Framework. OSH educators contribute significantly to children's development. You play a significant role in supporting children's learning, social and emotional development, as well as helping families to lay the foundations for children's lives. In essence, you have an important role in shaping our future. Let's take a moment to reflect on the overarching focus of Quality Area 1. Quality Area 1 provides a strong focus on enhancing children's learning and development through educators' professional practice, especially those aspects that involve building and nurturing relationships, curriculum decision-making, teaching and learning, and the skills and knowledge that educators can actively promote in collaboration with children and families. We've talked about the standards in the NQS relating to Quality Area 1. Now let's look at the minimum regulatory requirements that provide a strong foundation for the NQS and learning frameworks. Regulation 73 requires that an educational program contributes to the outcomes for each child identified in the approved learning frameworks. Educators need to be thinking about the learning outcomes when planning the program. Regulation 74. As part of the delivery of these educational programs, documentation is an integral and important part of the process, and Regulation 74 specifies what must be documented. The key things to remember is that for a school-aged child, you need to document evaluations of the child's well-being, development and learning. When you prepare your documentation, Regulation 74 requires that consideration is given to the period of time that the child is being educated and cared for by the service. You also need to think about how you will make information readily understandable by the educators at the service and for the family of the child. With Regulation 75, you must ensure information about the content and operation of the educational program is displayed at your premises, at a place that's accessible to families. You must also ensure that a copy of the educational program is available for inspection by an authorised officer at your service's premises upon request. Regulation 76. As we work in partnership with parents and families, we need to make information about the program and their child's participation readily accessible. Under the national law and national regulations, approved services are required to base their educational program on an approved learning framework. The program should focus on addressing the developmental and recreational needs, interests and experiences of each child, while taking into account the individual differences of each child. The approved learning framework that guides the work of outside school hours care services and individual educators within Australia is My Time, Our Place, Framework for School Age Care in Australia. The framework supports and guides educators working with school-aged children. The framework builds on the foundations of the Early Years Learning Framework, extending on the principles, practices and outcomes to the context and age range of the children and young people who attend school-age care settings, which may also be useful if you have very young school-aged children in the service. Your framework acknowledges the importance of play and leisure in children's learning and development, while acknowledging their current capabilities, as well as recognising the value of emerging and developing life skills. The learning framework assists you to meet the requirements of the National Quality Framework and to reflect on ongoing quality improvement. The key elements of the framework, principles, practice and learning outcomes, are fundamental to the way in which you develop your curriculum and should be reflected in all aspects of planning, practice and documentation. Just like us, children are ongoing learners and develop and learn in different ways. The cycle of planning helps educators to purposefully support children's continual learning and design meaningful learning opportunities. The ongoing cycle of planning is illustrated in the Educator's Guide to the Framework for School-Age Care and represents a model of decision-making as an ongoing cycle of information gathering, questioning, planning, acting or implementing, and reflecting. Now let's discuss the documentation aspect of the cycle of planning. The first step is gathering information. To plan for improvement or to extend children's learning, we must gather information to inform where to next and to help communicate children's learning. To do this, we must first gather evidence which can take many forms and include observing, citing and discussing, and then meaningfully documenting knowledge of children's current learning. The Learning Framework, National Quality Standard and regulations focus on the need for documentation, but are not prescriptive about how documentation should look, be presented or how it should be done. But it does need to be meaningful, relevant and helpful in making children's learning visible. Information gathering occurs through the planning cycle. There are many ways to gather information, such as through discussions with families, observations, photos, video recording and children's own contributions. Please turn to page 3 of the workbook and spend the next few minutes reflecting on how you gather information about the children at your service. Jot these down in the table provided in the workbook. Questioning is the second step in the cycle of planning. It involves analysing the information you've gathered and developing questions that will inform and guide your planning. If you're unsure about how to get started, there are lots of questions in the Educator's Guide to the Framework for School-Age Care on pages 11 to 16. Planning is the next process in the cycle. Planning involves organising learning experiences that support children to make progress towards objectives identified by using the approved learning framework. Planning involves organising the learning environment, selecting resources, developing teaching strategies and activities, considering learning outcomes, considering family input and cultural values. Effective planning also enables children, families and educators to have a voice in the planning process. Being aware of your skills and knowledge and the underlying perspectives they are based on will also help you to plan effectively. To help support in this process, the Educator's Guide to the Framework for School-Age Care has some reflective questions on pages 12 to 16. Please turn to page 4 of your workbook and spend a few moments thinking about the answer to the questions in the table. Note them down and then note any opportunities where you can adapt or change your practices to improve on planning. Acting is the next process in the cycle of planning. Acting involves putting plans into action. It's about responding to what you know and have planned for and enacting the plan to support children's learning. The practices and principles of the approved learning frameworks should guide the way the plan is enacted. This incorporates all aspects of the program such as routines, intentional teaching, planning and implementing learning through play. In acting as well as planning, we need to give thought to how we weave together adult-led learning or intentional teaching, guided play and learning, and child-directed play and learning. We also need to consider how children decide how they wish to learn and play. It's also important to think about the balance between planned and spontaneous experiences. Think about how you will engage with children in sustained conversations that promote further thinking. Again, there are some useful prompts to help you frame your thinking in the Educator's Guide to the Framework for School-Age Care. Before we move on to the next step in the planning cycle, please turn to page 6 of the workbook and think about the changes that have recently been made to practice in your service, and note them in column 1. In the second column, note down what led to making these changes. Take a couple of minutes to fill in column 2. Now in the last column, note down what difference these changes have made. Take another couple of minutes to fill out this final column. It doesn't matter if you haven't managed to complete all the columns. You can continue this later or do a similar activity with your colleagues. An activity of this kind is fairly simple but a good starter for critical reflection, which the data showed was a challenge for some services. The next step of the planning cycle, following action, is reflection. This aligns with element 1.2.3, which relates to critical reflection on children's learning and development. Critical reflection involves thinking about all aspects of experiences and considering different perspectives. Thinking that there is only one right way and not reflecting on your practice can mean that opportunities are lost for children's learning or may even be disadvantaged by it. In this section of the cycle, we need to be assessing and evaluating planned and unplanned experiences. As noted in the Educator's Guide to the Framework, evaluation should not simply consist of individual written work, but should also have group reflection and discussion. Children should also play a critical role in some overarching questions for reflective practice. However, more specific questions should be considered depending on the issue or experience. Some of these additional questions can be found on page 16 of the Educator's Guide to the Framework, and most resources on critical reflection. Using tools like this also helps build educator confidence in talking about critical reflection and practice, which can help if they're asked about it during an assessment and rating visit. Upon reflecting, you will then decide where to next. Using the information gathered, you are then able to contribute to children's ongoing learning by beginning the cycle of planning again. Here's a video from Catherine Lee, a fellow educator, discussing her views on critical reflection. While watching, think about how you view critical reflection. Make a note of some reflective questions that can be asked at a staff meeting, and note these on page 5 of the workbook. In the delivery of educational programs, documentation is an integral and important part of the process. And as mentioned previously, Regulation 74 specifies what must be documented. The key things to remember are that you need to document the child's well-being, development, and learning. When you prepare your documentation, you should be thinking about how you will make information readily understandable by the educators at the service and for families. There are a number of myths circulating about the expectations for documentation. For example, that the best way to do it is to number plans and records or to colour code them. Another is that you need to write a report on every child every day. The reality is that mandating a certain way of documenting, for example, the number of observations you make of each child, would limit your ability to be creative in documenting the richness in the program and children's learning. Remember that if you did a search on the legislation, ACECQA website, or even Google, nowhere will you find information about the minimum requirement of documentation needed to meet the National Quality Standard. One of the strengths of the National Quality Framework is that while acknowledging the important role of information gathering and documenting, it's not prescriptive about how it should be done. Recognising the uniqueness of each service, there is no one-size-fits-all approach, and educators are empowered to explore a range of styles and methods to determine what works best for their service, children, families, and educators. Sometimes we focus on the achievement being that we've made sure that we have all the boxes of a template filled in or lots of observations or examples of children's work, and we run out of time and energy to think about the actual value of that information and how it can inform our work with children and families. It's important to remember that documentation is only one part of the cycle, and we often focus on the glass half empty side of it and not on the glass half full side, and how it benefits the work we do and the environments we create for children. This would be a good activity to do in a staff meeting. You can copy the table on page 7 of the workbook and provide each person with a copy. Then divide the group into pairs. In pairs, interview each other, noting in the table what the partner has said. Take about 10 minutes to ask each other the 4 questions. The first question is to gain information about what the person you're interviewing is interested in. Note these in the first box. For the second question, note down in the second box what the person finds challenging. Note the answer to the third question in the third box. Here you are asking about areas that the person feels are important to them. The final box is to note the things the person does for recreation. Once the interviewing is complete for everyone, you can inform the group that in a space of less than 15 minutes, they managed to document something each person is interested in, finds challenging, things that are important to them, and recreational interest. All this for all those in the meeting and done relatively quickly. This activity demonstrates how easy it can be to gain valuable and useful information about someone else. If you were to look at the information collected, it would give lots of ideas about each person, what they like, what their interests are, and areas of development. You know the children in your service the best. Maybe this is a strategy you can use back in your service for children to gather and document information about themselves and each other. We sometimes get stuck thinking we have to be the ones to do all the documenting. This is a video of Jennifer Sumsion and Jennifer Cartmel discussing the intention behind documentation in OSH services. While watching the video, think about what is being talked about in relation to the value conversations can play. You need to develop strategies which are meaningful, relevant, and achievable for your context, that don't take away from your work with children and support the ongoing cycle of planning. As you are aware, documentation on children begins when they first start at your service. The enrolment form is the beginning of the child's profile. Over time, you will add further documentation, which will help you know more about that child's interests, needs, strengths, and challenges. As mentioned before, how you do this is up to you, and you can probably identify a number of strategies that have proven to be effective. Some examples of time-efficient strategies could be post-it notes, voice recording systems, videos, meeting discussion minutes, parent forms. It's equally important to collaborate with children. Remember, the learning frameworks promote the view of the child as capable and competent. Information gathering occurs throughout the planning cycle. There are many ways to gather information, such as through discussions with families, observations, photos, video recordings, and children's own contributions. Learning stories are just one method of observation, and there is no set number required to meet the NQS. It's not the amount of documentation you do, or how immaculately it's presented, but how it's used to inform your decision-making in a way which works most effectively for your service. You've most likely heard the term "keep it simple," and while that is a good motto, a variation on that, which might be more appropriate, is "keep it useful." Presentation will also differ between services and educators. Some ways to present the documentation could be records saved on a USB if families prefer, bound flipbooks, presentation boards, floor books. Educators need to be mindful of displaying private or personal information about children in public areas and consider where it may end up being displayed. It's also important to think about respecting the rights and privacy of children and their families. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, Article 12, notes that children have a right to be involved in decisions that affect them. Children also have a right to have their opinions listened to. An example is asking children if it's okay to take their photo, rather than making the decision for them and snapping away while they're involved in experiences to suit your purposes. It's important to be mindful of the practices you do that might be taking away the rights of the children and families. For example, children's preference regarding how and if their work is displayed or shared. The National Quality Framework notes that documentation needs to be meaningful, relevant, and helpful in making children's learning visible. The purpose of documentation is to gather information to help you plan for future learning, reflect, serve as a means of collaboration with children, families, staff and communities, and analyse and keep track of children's learning, development and well-being in a way that can meaningfully influence their further learning. It's also a great way to track, acknowledge, share and celebrate achievements. Here's a video of how one service discussed the planning cycle in a planning and reflection meeting. There are various resources available to support you in your role. On the ACECQA website, the Educators and Providers Library contains data, templates, posters, newsletters and fact sheets, as well as the National Education Leader page. Also available on the ACECQA website are the approved learning frameworks, the accompanying educators' guides, as well as the resource kit documents, including the Guide to the National Quality Standard and the Guide to the National Law and Regulations. While you're there, if you haven't already, sign up to the ACECQA newsletter and Facebook page. Our Facebook community provides a great connection to the sector and provides regular information on new resources that are available. The National Education Leader webpage discusses topics of interest and provides links to relevant resources. The Early Childhood Resource Hub provides the central source of Australian education and care resources, quality standards, support and forums. Registering with the Early Childhood Resource Hub is free and provides access to hundreds of digital resources and an innovative discussions area specifically constructed around each of the 7 quality areas in the National Quality Standard. This aims to support educational leadership, programming, self-assessment, critical reflection, and to inform implementation of quality improvement within services. As we've explored in this presentation, educators' professional judgments are central to their active role in facilitating children's learning. In making professional judgments, you continuously seek ways to build on your professional knowledge, skills and experience, knowledge of the children, families and communities. It's good that you're being empowered to make choices about reflection and documentation. You also draw on creativity, imagination and insight to help improvise and adjust practice to suit the time, place and context of learning. As a final note, take some time to consider how the discussion on the ongoing cycle of planning and critical reflection may empower you as an educator, enhance your professional development, and inform the active role you play in facilitating quality outcomes for children in your service. Also remember that the work you do around educational program and practice is really important, and if nothing else, your motivation should be because of the benefits of it to the children at your service. There are a number of agencies available to provide support to your service. NOSHSA's website has links to your local associations. Their website is on the last page of the workbook. Contact ACECQA for clarification on the legislative requirements, to have your qualifications checked or assessed, for help with the NQA ITS, for a second-tier review or an excellent rating application. Contact your regulatory authority for clarification on the legislative requirements, to discuss compliance issues, information relating to service and provider approvals, to apply for a first-tier review, or to follow up on notification or application forms. Thank you for participating, and remember that outside school hours care is largely about creating, innovating, and cultivating curiosity, not solely for children but educators as well. We wish you well as you continue down a learning path that parallels the one you so meaningfully and purposefully create for children.